everyone, and welcome to Untamed Unfiltered. I'm Amanda Nicholson.
And I am Aaron Provencio, and today we are joined by the Wildlife Center's Vice President of Administration, Lacy Kegley. How's it going today, Lacy?
Hey guys, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So, for those of you out there who may not know Lacy, she, like Aaron said, she is our Vice President of Administration, but she is also a big time bird nerd. So, we
Guilty.
knew when we were talking about migration, we were like, oh, we should just talk to Lacy because she'll have lots of things to say.
It's true. I do love birds. I started out, well, I've always, had the appreciation for nature, but when I was in college and one of my final semesters, I took an ornithology class as like a fun class. It was known as like colloquially as like the bird watching class. It was a lot more than that, but it definitely opened the door to recognizing the importance of organismal biology as well, and looking at individuals and not just looking at cells and molecules under a microscope, which is what I was doing up to that point. So I did this bird watching class, ornithology, and learned more about birds. And I really think too that triggered my interest in the Wildlife Center to start with, to be a student at first. So in some ways, my bird watching got me here.
Interesting. So now migration happens all across the world with all sorts of different species. Obviously, today we're kind of focusing on birds. But here in Virginia, we're actually at a pretty unique position because apparently we're right in the middle of the Atlantic flyway, right? One of the four major migration flyways that we have in North America. And naturally, I'm not from around here, right? I'm still learning. And I've heard that if you're in the right place at the right time, you can see thousands of birds flying overhead during parts of the year. Is that correct?
It is. Actually, we're neighbors practically with a very cool location called the Rockfish Gap Hawk Watch up on the top of Afton Mountain. They do have an open house every year that I always try to go to. It's during peak migration for the fall. I'm not sure if they're having it this year or not. But there are other locations throughout Virginia as well. There is a hawk watch out on the coast in Kiptopeke. We've actually released eagles there before, the Wildlife Center has. And then there's locations both in Northern Virginia, I think it's called Snickers Gap, and then in Southwest Virginia as well. And those are areas that monitor the hawk numbers that are flying over and flying through. They monitor other birds as well and submit that for data. But some of these locations have been operating for decades at this point. Rockfish Gap, for example, I think their first year of recording and submitting that data was back in the 60s. So it's been going on for a really long time, and this gives us a lot of data to compare like what numbers are each year, how this year compares to last year. Actually up at Rockfish Gap as well, they do have a website. I recommend everyone check it out because it's fascinating. But they have records not only of how many birds and what species of those birds, what ages of those individuals are flying through, but they also have down to the hour of how many of those birds are flying through. So it's not just like where they're recording a day's worth of data. It's down to the hour and sometimes even more nitty gritty than that.
Yeah, that's information, and their whole counts that they do are pretty amazing. It's even if you can't get up to Rockfish Gap right here to watch the birds and watch the birders in action yourself, I think it's fascinating to watch their website updates daily of like, when that peak is coming because it just keeps building. And then all of a sudden it's like one day, 10,000 broad wings. And you're like, how is that? How do they even do that? It's crazy.
They are really, really good at it. They have those little counters and they never stop. And also they've done these presentations at their open houses every so often where they talk about how they identify different species, because even being a bird watcher and being familiar with some of these species, they do look different when they're flying and when they're on, when they're in migration, but looking at those very specific wing shapes very specific feather patterns for birds that are high up that you can't see with the naked eye. Fascinating.
So obviously we just did this whole episode about migration, which to me is something that we just kind of refer to quite often of like, oh, birds migrate. That is a thing that they do. But I know I personally maybe don't stop to think about all the components of migration and like how crazy dangerous it is for birds. So like in a normal circumstance, birds have to get enough food and enough energy to make those sorts of long distance movements. They need to find stopover places to rest and avoid predators and deal with disease risks and then like natural disasters. And then you add the human caused dangers on top of that too. And when you think about that, it's like, wow, it's amazing that any birds can survive to make the trip and then much less make it back in the spring to do it all over again every year.
It's true. And they make these trips with like twice a year, that they are traveling thousands of miles, and some birds travel thousands and thousands of miles. And the dangers, I mean, we've read about this in our book club books. We read about the red knot that travels from the tip of South America all the way up into northern North America. And we read about in that book how dangerous this is. We have also read about the hawk watch. Speaking of hawk watches, but Hawk Mountain, Rosalie Edge, one of my all-time favorite people, and her impact with Hawk Mountain and how that was also risky, back in a time whenever people would harvest these animals for game. Basically it was like hawks were treated as like a game species. Or game animals, and so they would shoot just thousands and thousands of them, and I mean, we'll never really know the repercussions of that on the populations that we have today, but certainly those repercussions have been felt. But then there's also struggles that these birds face in the places where they're going. Here we have certain laws against specific biocides, pesticides, and things like that used in farming. That's not true of everywhere. Different countries have different laws that protect birds. So some of these birds are also taken from the wild to be put into the pet trade. They're taken into captivity for their feathers to be used in decorations and things like that, especially very colorful birds like painted buntings. There's a lot of risk that our birds face, and it is funny, kind of looking in your backyard at like maybe that junco that is flied in for the winter, or an indigo bunting that's flying through on his way to wherever he goes, and wondering like, where did you come from, bud? What kind of struggles did you face there? Because we see the struggles in our own backyards. We see the struggles that, with habitat destruction or outdoor cats or other things that we've talked about too during Untamed. But these are challenges that these animals are facing all over the place, wherever they fly. Not to mention that some of these birds, are flying across large bodies of water as well, and that has its own struggles. They have to have that weight on them. You don't think about like a tiny hummingbird having to like pack on a bunch of weight, but they have to fly over the Gulf of Mexico and through the Caribbean to get to where they're going, a lot of them.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible the challenges that these birds go through all across their entire migratory route every single year, twice a year. And recently, last year, an article was published in the journal Science, which is a very well-respected scientific journal, saying that since the year 1970, North America has lost 3 billion birds, which is everything from our backyard songbirds, birds of prey, long-distance migrants, seabirds, different species like that. And I was wondering, just being not only somebody who is very interested in birds in general, but also somebody who works in conservation, how does that number strike you?
It's sad, but not entirely unsurprising, you know, or not entirely surprising. And that's only for North America, which is also devastating, you know, because we're losing so many birds to these issues, and these are issues that exist here domestically that we can do things about, but also abroad, and we have our own way of influencing those as well. So there's a lot of deforestation that's happening in, let's say, where I'm familiar with in South America. As far as those birds who travel here, they, whenever they're going back to their winter grounds, they're, you know, sometimes they're not there anymore. That tree that they always, 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 you know, catch their favorite bugs in, or maybe there's a fruit that grows there that they always eat the seeds of, or something like that. If that's gone, then they have to relocate, and that adds risk to those birds. That adds an unknown, and makes them more susceptible to things like starvation, but also to predation, because it might leave them exposed. It might leave them, they're scrambling to try to figure out individually, you know, what they do. What do you do whenever you're going home from work and your house is no longer standing there? That sort of thing. Yeah. So our birds that we see, even those that we see in our backyard, or those that we see at a hawk watch, like broadwing hawks that have a very, very far migration down to places like Costa Rica and Panama and even parts of South America, those birds are facing so many challenges along the way, and honestly, a lot of them we can't even begin to understand. There are some bigger challenges as well as our planet changes, right? We're in the midst of our planet getting a little bit warmer and our climate changing, and that leading to, at least with what some climatologists say, more intense storms. And those storms a lot of times do happen whenever there's migrations happening as well. So one hurricane or one bad storm can take out a huge, huge percentage of a population if they're in the midst of their migration.
So the other thing that I was reminded of, you brought up some book club books, Lacy, which I forgot about the Red Knot one, but yeah, we've really read a lot over the years.
We have.
In our little club. But the additional one that really ties into what Erin just said as well is The Silence of the Songbirds, which was like one of our first books that we read within our first year of doing book club. And that to me was, man, that might be, I think that's like one of my top 3 favorite ones that we've read, just because it really did illustrate a lot of the perils with migration. Like you were saying, it really underscored the whole notion of like, they're not just our birds. Like we think of broad-winged hawks as like, yes, they're native to Virginia, but they're not here for a good chunk of the year because they all fly elsewhere. And yeah, same sort of thing of like, I get super excited when I see catbirds in my yard in the spring. Like this year I heard them and I full on stopped what I was doing and was like, oh my God, you're back. And to me, it's like what have they done? Wait, like tell me everything that you've been up to. But wherever they go for their winter, do they have people who are equally excited to see them and like looking out for them? I think that the Silence of the Songbird book did a really nice job of like breaking it down and kind of telling some stories from like a perspective of an individual bird. And I think she really hammered a lot on the pesticide issue too, because that can be so differently regulated between countries.
Yes, and on Silence of the Songbirds, one of my big takeaways also with the pesticides and the use of biocides was the point that she made about shade-grown coffee. Do you remember that?
Yes, that is why we drink shade-grown coffee at the Wildlife Center.
That's right. It changed how I drink coffee at home, and it changed how we drink coffee at the center too. One thing that the author talked about was the fact that a lot of area is cleared in the rainforest to make room for coffee plants and coffee plantations. And coffee is, she went into great detail about this, and I'll try not to go into as much detail, but she talked about how acres of rainforest are cleared for these coffee plants to grow. And the coffee plants grow at a faster rate if you just clear all of the land, make room just for coffee. But she talked about the benefits of shade-grown coffee, not only for the birds and for the wildlife, but also for the economics as well. Coffee plants that are grown in a rainforest have a little bit of a longer lifespan. Even though it takes them a little bit longer to get started, overall, they actually end up being more productive for the coffee growers. So this is something that benefits not only humans, but benefits our bird friends as well, because it does not take away their habitat, and it leads to longer and overall more success, both for those areas and for those economies, and also for me and for Aaron.
I'm drinking coffee right now.
That's right.
I hope it's shade grown. If it's not, that'll be my next buy for sure. So Lacy, I mean, naturally we have to ask the question, but what is your all-time favorite bird?
Oh my gosh, that is the hardest question. Because that would vary, honestly, from day to day, hour to hour sometimes. I definitely have an appreciation for all birds, and they're all fascinating in their own way, right? I think a lot of, several birders at least that I've talked to that have gotten started with birding, they're really drawn by those big birds, by, eagles and hawks and owls and like the more sexy species. But inevitably they become more enthralled as well with those little birds that flit in inside and out. What are they doing? Birds are so intentional. They don't, this was something actually that was discussed in another book club book that we read recently, that birds always have a purpose for what they're doing. And that once you start watching them and learning that all of their motions and all of their activities are motivated by a drive for food or for resources, a drive to find a mate, a drive to feed their offspring, I think that it draws in that fascination. So I different times of the year, I have different favorite birds. I definitely look forward more to winter now, even though I'm not a cold loving person at all, but I do love seeing those little dark-eyed juncos in my yard. They are just the cutest little things. And then I have a family of ravens that live not far from me, so they fly over from time to time, and I have an appreciation for corvids in general. Also, another book club book, Gift of the Crow. Really just talking about all the book club books. Other birds as well. I mean, there's so many birds, honestly, that we get through here and that we see whenever we travel to other new places. One of my favorite things to do wherever I go is just to check out a local park, check out the local area, to find some water somewhere and see what kind of water birds are there, because those vary so much from place to place. And that leads to just birds all over the place. I'm unfortunately, I can't give you an answer on that.
That's all right. We'll let it slide, but we'll toss the same question over to Amanda. I'm curious if you have a favorite bird.
Yeah, I feel like Lacy's answer was spoken like a true bird nerd, right? Like, wow. As I mentioned before, I really like catbirds a lot. I love their calls, and they just seem like they just make a lot of weird nonsense calls sometimes, which mean a lot to them, but to me it sounds like nonsense, and I love it. And I love their little mew. I also really like robins, and I kind of on principle want to like really common birds that people kind of take for granted, but they're just kind of cool and spunky and sassy, and I like how they just like run all over the ground all the time. What about you, Aaron?
My favorite bird is the western meadowlark. I don't know where west turns to east, because I know there's an eastern meadowlark too, but out in Colorado, my house is on the prairie, and that makes it sound like I was a pioneer. It's like in a prairie, like there's a lot of grass around us, and the summer was always kind of ushered in by all these meadowlarks showing up, and they'd stand on top of their little reeds, and sing, and it's just this beautiful call. And for me, every time when I was a kid, you'd hear the meadowlarks, and it's like, oh, okay, now it's officially summer. So it makes me happy whenever I hear it.
No.
Just
We
a
do
little,
have
little air on
meadowlarks
the
here in
prairie.
Virginia.
What?
We do have meadowlarks here. I've seen a lot of them in Stanton. There's this road that a lot of birders use in Stanton. Not use, that seems weird, but like it's a good place to bird, and it's an easy walk, and it's like a nice little jog. Like if you're a runner, like it's a nice place to run too. And there's short-eared owls on this road. There's meadowlarks. There's all these birds that are seen there for whatever reason. I've seen kestrels there. Yeah. So.
Okay, I'll have to check it out, because like summer hasn't started yet for me. It's just a long, long spring because there's no meadowlarks yet. So.
Oh yeah.
I feel like this is a risky question to get into with a bird nerd, just in that, like, you know, we don't want to be here for another hour. But for the true bird nerd audiences out there too, I'm sure they will want to know, what would you say of your like list of birds that you have? Maybe this is a two-part question. Like, what has been the most recent, most exciting addition for your life list, if you have an official one? I'm assuming you do. And what bird do you like most want to see?
Oh my gosh. It's easy to answer the second one because I really, really want to see a puffin. Honestly, any of the puffins I would love to see, but I just haven't gotten to see a puffin yet. And when I do, I will cry. I promise. The birds that meant the most to sing, I think at the time that this was in 2014 or so, I believe, we were having a snowy owl eruption, and I had went out to see where a snowy owl had been spotted here locally a few times, and I always missed it somehow. He just wasn't in a very obvious spot. There was some debris around, and I think he was hiding under it, and or around it or behind it. And I finally saw him on January 1st of that year, and even looking back, it was very emotional. And that was probably one of those those moments that I will just always remember. There are others too, some other, birds that I went specifically to see, or like I wasn't planning to see, but then there he was. A couple of those, and I could get specific there too, but I will resist. The cool birds like that, and migrants coming through too, because you have such a short window to see them, right? Like, you have basically whenever they're flying through your area, and so it makes it all the more of a rush whenever you can actually get there to see them, and that it's almost like a gift from that bird sometimes, of like, I got to see that, bird nerd.
And back on the topic of those migrating birds, I'm wondering if there's anything special that you do to help them out on their journey?
Yeah, there's actually a lot that we can do aside from supporting industries like with shade grown coffee, and just being more mindful of what the impact of our purchases has long term, or where our goods that we consume are coming from. Just personally, like on a day-to-day basis, I think it's just important to be mindful of some little details, things like cleaning your bird feeders if you keep bird feeders out in your yard. Seed feeders should be, especially in migration, whenever we have a lot of birds flying through, seed feeders should be cleaned depending on how much use they get every couple of weeks. So really easy to clean. Just I use, my water hose and a 10% bleach solution, spray them down really good, hose them off, let them dry out, and then fill them back up. Other things to consider would be a hummingbird feeder as well. Like, cleaning those is a little bit different because you do have to feed them or clean them like every day. especially whenever it's so hot. The sugar water will go bad more quickly, so being mindful to keep those in rotation very quickly so that you don't make any birds sick. Just being a responsible bird feeder person. Some other things to keep in mind for migrants would be things like keeping your lights off at night. That's something that throws off some migrating birds. Migration is a tricky thing, and some birds use light, some birds use the sun or the stars, or in some we just don't know what they use. But best to have as little impact on that as possible by just keeping our lights turned off at night. Another thing that we can do as homeowners and property owners is to avoid using things like pesticides and biocides, being mindful that whatever we use in our homes and that we put on our yards doesn't stay there. You know, it all goes out and goes somewhere else, and that will impact our environment eventually, and likely in ways that we don't see, but we know that it's having an impact. So avoiding using Roundup, get out there, weed with the hands, good old-fashioned weeding, and being mindful whenever we do pick up things from the grocery store that say that they will make our lives easier in the yard or in the garden or around the home, that we need to be mindful about what the components are in there and how it's going to impact our birds and the other residents who have to live here too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Lacy, and bird nerding it up with us as we talked more about migration. Yeah, we had a good time chatting with you, and thank you guys out there for watching. This has been Untamed Unfiltered, and we will see you next week.
You ready? 1, 2, 3.